Driving the West Coast isn't for the faint of heart. Twisting roads, steep cliffs, and towns so small they barely show up on a map. But I'd been at this job long enough to think I could handle anything. That night, though, I found out just how wrong I was. I'd picked up a load in Seattle and was heading south toward San Francisco. Somewhere near the Oregon-California border, a road closure forced me to reroute. My GPS wasn't much help. This was a remote stretch of highway I'd never been on before, and the signal kept cutting in and out. It was late, pitch black, except for the beam of my headlights slicing through the thick fog. After an hour of driving aimlessly, I saw it. A car parked on the side of the road, hazard lights flashing. Normally I wouldn't stop. It's just not worth the risk these days. But I was tired, hungry, and frustrated, and I figured the driver might know the area. I pulled over, climbed out of my cab, and approached the car. A man stood next to it, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. He was thin, wiry, and his clothes looked old, like he'd stepped out of a different decade. "Hey," I called out, keeping a bit of distance. "Everything okay?" The man nodded slowly, his head turning toward me. His eyes glinted in the dim light, and something about his smile put me on edge. "Just a flat," he said. His voice was low and gravelly, like he hadn't spoken in days. Tough luck," I said, shifting on my feet. "Listen, I'm a bit turned around, looking for somewhere to eat. You know a good spot?" His grin widened, showing crooked teeth. "Sure do. Head down this road about 5 miles. You'll see a sign for a place called The Fork, best food around." "Appreciate it," I said, glancing back at my truck. "Drive safe now," he said, his voice trailing off as I climbed back into my cab. Something about the exchange didn't sit right with me, but hunger won out over instinct. 5 miles later, I saw the sign, The Fork, open late. The arrow pointed down a narrow, unpaved road leading into a small, quiet town. The place didn't look like much, just a handful of buildings clustered together, their windows dark. The restaurant stood out, though, its neon sign buzzing faintly. I parked my truck on the street and stepped out. The air was thick and still, and there wasn't a single person in sight. I took a few steps toward the restaurant, but stopped cold. Something was wrong. The neon sign flickered, casting shadows that seemed to dance on their own. A faint sound reached my ears, footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from all directions. I turned and saw them, figures emerging from the shadows, men with hammers, bats, and metal pipes in their hands. Their faces were emotionless, their eyes fixed on me. "Hell no," I muttered, spinning on my heel and bolting back to my truck. The mob moved fast, their footsteps pounding against the pavement. My heart was in my throat as I reached the door and yanked it open. I barely had time to climb in and slam it shut before they surrounded the truck. They started hitting the cab, metal tools slamming against the sides, shattering one of the side mirrors. The sound was deafening, like 100 alarms going off at once. I threw the truck into gear, my hands shaking as I stomped on the accelerator. The engine roared, and the truck lurched forward, scattering the mob. One man jumped onto the side step, pounding on the window with a wrench. His face was inches from mine, twisted into a grotesque snarl. I swerved hard, sending him flying onto the road. I didn't stop, I didn't look back. The truck barreled down the unpaved road, the tires kicking up rocks and dust. My knuckles were white as I gripped the wheel, my heart pounding so loud it drowned out the sound of the engine. When I finally reached the highway, I didn't slow down. I drove straight through the night, not stopping until I hit a major truck stop near the California line. I parked under the bright lights and sat there, shaking, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But no matter how I turned it over in my mind, one thing was clear. That wasn't just some quiet town, and those men weren't after my wallet or my truck. They were after me. I've been driving trucks across South Carolina for over 20 years, and I've seen my fair share of strange things on the road. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened that night. I'd been hauling a load from Charleston to Greenville, and I was dead tired. My eyes felt like sandpaper, and I knew if I didn't pull over, I might end up in a ditch, or worse. So I decided to stop at a truck stop just off the highway. It wasn't one of the big chain stops, just a small, dimly lit place with a couple of pumps, a store, and a lot full of parked rigs. As I pulled in, something caught my eye. There was a young woman walking back and forth in front of the store. She looked like she was in her early 20s, maybe. Pretty, slim, with long dark hair that caught the glow of the neon lights. She was wearing a tight t-shirt and a mini skirt that seemed out of place for the chilly night air. I parked my truck and watched her for a moment through the windshield. She didn't seem to be going anywhere, just pacing. Maybe she was waiting for someone, I thought. Shrugging it off, I climbed down from the cab and headed inside the store. I grabbed a coffee and a pack of peanuts to keep me awake for the rest of the drive. The clerk didn't say much, just grunted when I paid, and I headed back out to my truck. But when I got to the cab, my heart nearly stopped. The girl was sitting in my passenger seat. She was just there like she belonged. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, and she was staring straight ahead, her face expressionless. I yanked the door open. "What the hell are you doing in my truck?" She didn't answer. "Hey, I'm talking to you. You need to get out now." Nothing. She didn't even flinch, just kept staring out the windshield. I stood there for a moment, my mind racing. Part of me thought about calling the cops, but the other part just wanted to get the hell out of there. I figured maybe she was drunk or on something, and I didn't want to get tangled up in whatever mess she was in. "Fine," I muttered, slamming the door shut. "Suit yourself." I climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled out of the lot. The girl didn't say a word, didn't even look at me. I tried to talk to her as I drove. "Where are you going? Do you need a ride somewhere?" "Nothing. Listen, you can't just sit here and not say anything. I'm not a damn taxi." Still nothing. After about 20 minutes of silence, I was starting to lose my patience. She was creeping me out, sitting there so still and quiet. Finally, I reached over, placing my hand lightly on her thigh. "Hey," I said, "you need to tell me what's going on." That's when she screamed. It wasn't a normal scream. It was guttural, inhuman, like something out of a nightmare. Her head snapped toward me, her eyes wide and glowing a sickly yellow. Her mouth twisted into a grin that stretched far too wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth that looked more like fangs. Her skin turned pale, almost translucent, and her hands, God, her hands grew long, bony, with claws that scraped against the dashboard. "Don't touch me," she screeched, her voice echoing in the cab like it was coming from everywhere at once. I slammed on the brakes, the truck screeching to a halt in the middle of the road. My heart was hammering in my chest as I threw the door open and jumped out, nearly stumbling onto the asphalt. I turned back to the truck, my breath fogging in the cool night air. She was gone. The passenger seat was empty, like she had never been there. The cab was silent except for the low hum of the engine. I climbed back in, shaking, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I looked around, under the seat, even behind the cab, but there was no trace of her, no footprints, no scratches, nothing. I drove straight home that night, my eyes darting to the passenger seat every few seconds. I didn't stop until I pulled into my driveway, my chest still tight with fear. I don't know what she was or where she came from, but I haven't stopped at that truck stop or any other random one since. And every time I get behind the wheel at night, I can still hear that scream, echoing in my mind, reminding me that some things on the road aren't meant to be picked up. I've driven trucks long enough to know that rural roads can get downright eerie at night. No streetlights, no signs, just the hum of the engine and the endless dark. But that night, somewhere on a back road in Nebraska, I found out there's more to fear out there than just getting lost. I was hauling a load of grain, heading toward a small town for an early morning delivery. It was past midnight, and the road stretched on, straight and flat, flanked by endless fields of tall corn swaying in the wind. My headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the two-lane road and little else. I was cruising along, trying to keep myself awake with some old country tunes, when I noticed something strange up ahead. At first, it looked like a deer, or maybe some roadkill, a dark lump lying right in the middle of my lane. I slowed down, squinting to get a better look. As the truck rolled closer, I realized it wasn't an animal. It was a bundle of something, wrapped in a tarp. I stopped the truck, flicking on my hazards. My first thought was that it had fallen off another vehicle. People lose cargo all the time on these back roads, but something about it felt off. I climbed down from the cab, grabbing my flashlight. The night was dead silent except for the soft rustle of the cornfields. I approached the bundle cautiously, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dark. When I got close, I froze. The tarp wasn't covering some cargo. It was wrapped around something shaped like a person. My stomach dropped and my grip on the flashlight tightened. I stepped back, my mind racing. It was probably just some prank, I told myself. Kids messing around. That kind of thing happens, right? I glanced around, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The cornfields swayed gently, the wind whispering through the stalks. And then I heard it, a low guttural sound like someone groaning. I whipped my flashlight around, aiming it at the tarp. It hadn't moved, but the sound was unmistakable. My heart was pounding now, and every instinct screamed at me to get back in the truck and leave. But what if someone was hurt? What if this wasn't some prank? I edged closer, my boots crunching on the gravel. "Hey," I called out, my voice shaky. "You all right?" No response, just another low groan, faint but chilling. I reached out with the flashlight, using it to nudge the tarp. It shifted slightly, and I could see something underneath. Dirty, pale skin. That was enough for me. I turned and bolted back to the truck, my pulse hammering in my ears. I climbed into the cab and locked the doors, fumbling for my phone. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely dial 911. As I explained the situation to the dispatcher, I kept my eyes on the tarp. It still hadn't moved. "Stay in your vehicle," the dispatcher said firmly. "We're sending someone out." I hung up, gripping the wheel like it would somehow make me feel safer. The minutes dragged on, the silence pressing in around me. And then in my rearview mirror, I saw movement. A figure stepped out of the cornfields. It was tall, lanky, and its gait was unnatural, like it wasn't used to walking. It stopped near the tarp, crouching down beside it. My breath caught in my throat as it began to unwrap the tarp, its long fingers working with eerie precision. Whatever was inside the tarp sat up. I couldn't make out its face, just the shape of its head turning toward me. Suddenly, my truck's engine sputtered and died. The headlights flickered off, plunging me into darkness. Come on," I muttered, fumbling to restart the engine. When the lights flickered back on, the road was empty. The tarp, the figure, the thing that had been inside, it was all gone. I didn't wait to figure out where they went. I fired up the engine and got out of there, driving as fast as my rig could handle. I didn't stop until I reached a truck stop miles away, surrounded by bright lights and other drivers. Even now, I can't explain what I saw that night. I don't know if it was real or if exhaustion and the dark played tricks on me. But every time I pass a cornfield, I can't help but scan the edges, half expecting to see that figure watching, waiting for its next unlucky visitor.